When you walk through the narrow streets of old European towns, you might pass buildings that have been standing since the Middle Ages. It's mind-blowing to think that some of these houses have survived wars, fires, storms, and centuries of use, all without modern construction technology. To understand how medieval builders created structures so durable that we can still visit them today, we first need to look at the different social classes who lived in them, since the quality and building techniques varied dramatically depending on who you were in medieval society. The medieval society was like a giant pyramid, with each level playing a crucial role in keeping everything running smoothly. At the very top sat the royalty, kings and queens who lived lives of luxury while making important decisions about wars, laws, and taxes. These folks were basically born winning the medieval lottery, with their power passed down through family lines. Just below them were the nobles, who owned massive amounts of land and spent their days managing estates, hosting fancy feasts, and occasionally joining the king in battle, though they probably wished they could skip that part. The middle class was where things got interesting. These were your medieval entrepreneurs, merchants who sold goods in the market, skilled craftsmen who could turn a piece of wood into a masterpiece, and guild masters who ran the medieval version of trade schools. They weren't swimming in gold like the nobles, but they could afford decent food and maybe even a second pair of shoes, which was a pretty big deal back then. Then came the peasants, making up about 90% of the population. These hardworking folks were the backbone of medieval society, though they probably didn't get thanked much for it. They worked the land from sunrise to sunset, growing food for everyone else while barely keeping enough for themselves. Some were free peasants who could move around and choose their work, while others were serfs, basically tied to their lord's land, like a medieval version of a permanent job contract, except with more mud and fewer vacation days. Each class had specific duties that kept medieval society functioning. The royalty and nobles were supposed to protect everyone else, though sometimes they were more interested in protecting their wine cellars. They also served as judges, settling disputes between their subjects. Imagine a medieval Judge Judy, but with more power to send people to the dungeon. The middle class kept the economy buzzing by creating and selling goods. They formed guilds that were like medieval labor unions mixed with quality control departments. Want to become a blacksmith? Better spend years as an apprentice learning how not to burn your eyebrows off before the guild would let you open your own shop. Peasants had the most physically demanding role. They farmed the land, raised livestock, and basically provided all the food. Without them, everyone else would have gone hungry, including those nobles in their fancy castles. They also had to pay taxes in the form of crops and labor, which probably made modern tax season look like a walk in the park. The church played a massive role too, with religious leaders straddling multiple social classes. They provided education, though mostly to boys from wealthy families, helped the poor when they weren't too busy building elaborate cathedrals, and generally tried to keep everyone's moral compass pointing in the right direction. One fascinating fact about medieval society was that social mobility was about as rare as a peasant with perfect teeth. If you were born a peasant, you'd probably die a peasant. However, there were a few clever folks who managed to climb the social ladder through education, usually by joining the church or becoming skilled craftsmen. It was like a medieval rags to slightly better rags story. The whole system was held together by something called feudalism, a fancy term for "I'll protect you if you work for me and give me stuff." It wasn't exactly fair, but it kept things running for centuries, even if the peasants might have had some choice words about the arrangement, which they wisely kept to themselves, as medieval nobles weren't known for their sense of humor about criticism. The structure of medieval society didn't just shape how people lived and worked, it literally shaped how they built their cities, carving social hierarchies into stone and mortar. Medieval cities were like layer cakes of social status, except instead of sweet frosting between the layers, you had narrow, winding streets that probably hadn't seen a good cleaning since the Romans left town. These cities grew in a circular pattern, with the most important buildings smack in the middle. At the heart stood either a massive cathedral reaching toward heaven or a castle that made sure everyone knew who was boss. Sometimes both, just in case anyone forgot who ran the show. The wealthy neighborhoods spread out from this center like ripples in a pond, but instead of getting weaker, they got progressively more cramped and smelly. Rich merchants and skilled craftsmen claimed the prime real estate near the center, close enough to smell the incense from the cathedral, but far enough from the outer walls to avoid the first wave of any attacking army. Medieval real estate agents really had to consider different selling points back then. Speaking of walls, they were the medieval equivalent of a gated community, except instead of keeping out door-to-door salesmen, they were designed to stop entire armies. These massive stone barriers could be up to 30 feet high and 12 feet thick, making modern security systems look like child's play. Cities usually had between 2 and 8 gates that closed at sunset, which meant if you were late getting home, you might have to explain yourself to some rather grumpy guards. The middle-class neighborhoods were a maze of timber-framed houses packed tighter than sardines in a barrel. These areas were organized by trade. You'd find the Tanner's Street, which everyone avoided because of the smell, the Baker's Street, which everyone loved for obvious reasons, and the Blacksmith's Quarter, where you couldn't hear yourself think. It was like a medieval shopping mall, except with more risk of fire and plague. Moving toward the outer walls, things got increasingly interesting. And by interesting, we mean challenging for anyone with a sensitive nose. The poorest residents lived in tiny wooden shacks crammed against the city walls. These neighborhoods were so densely packed that residents could literally reach out their windows and shake hands with their neighbors across the street, though they probably tried to avoid doing that during plague season. Streets in medieval cities weren't just paths for walking, they were the medieval version of a multi-purpose room. Markets sprung up everywhere, animals roamed freely, doing what animals do if you catch my drift, and apprentices worked right outside their masters' shops. The noise would have been constant, hammering from carpenters, shouting from vendors, arguing from lawyers. Some things never change. And the occasional town crier telling everyone what the king had for breakfast. One particularly fascinating aspect of medieval city planning was the complete lack of it. Streets formed naturally based on foot traffic, which explains why European city centers today look like a plate of spaghetti thrown against a wall. The only straight streets were usually Roman roads that survived, standing out like an arrow in a haystack. Water sources were crucial. Wells and fountains dotted the cityscape, serving as medieval water coolers where people gathered to gossip about the latest scandal at the royal court or complain about taxes, another timeless tradition. Rivers running through cities were both a blessing and a curse, great for trade and washing. Not so great when they flooded or when someone upstream decided to dump something unsavory. The city's layout reflected its security needs too. Wider streets often ran in circles around the center, allowing defenders to quickly move between different parts of the wall during attacks. These same streets also hosted parades and festivals, proving that medieval urban planners understood the concept of multi-purpose design, even if they didn't plan much else. While the city's layout prioritized defense and celebration, individual buildings told their own stories of medieval ingenuity and economics, particularly in the homes of the growing merchant class. The middle class of medieval times lived in houses that would make modern building inspectors lose sleep, but these structures were actually pretty clever for their time. The typical middle-class home was built using a technique called timber framing, huge wooden beams fitted together like a giant puzzle with the gaps filled in with wattle and daub. Basically, a mixture of sticks, mud, and animal poop. Yes, you read that right. These homes typically cost around 2 to 3 years' worth of a skilled craftsman's salary, which was about the same as 1,500 days' worth of bread. The ground floor usually featured a shop or workshop facing the street where the owner could sell their goods or practice their trade. Behind this was a kitchen area with a hearth that served as both the family's cooking spot and their medieval version of central heating. The smoke from the fire would rise up through the house and eventually find its way out through holes in the roof, making these homes the world's first, albeit unintentional, smoke-preserved buildings. Your clothes always smelled like barbecue, but hey, at least you were warm. Upper floors contained the living quarters, with each floor typically being one big room divided by hanging tapestries or wooden screens. Privacy wasn't really a medieval strong suit. The whole family often slept in the same room, along with any apprentices living with them. The beds were raised platforms filled with straw, changed yearly if you were fancy, never if you weren't. And people slept sitting up because they believed lying flat would invite death, though this might have had more to do with avoiding the smoke than any superstition. Storage was built into every possible nook and cranny. Clever, built-in cupboards and chests held everything from tools to textiles. The windows were covered with oiled parchment or thin animal horn instead of glass, which was astronomically expensive. These translucent coverings let in some light while keeping out most of the rain and only some of the draft. Medieval folks were tough cookies when it came to dealing with the cold. One particularly interesting feature was the jettied upper floors. Each story stuck out about 2 feet further than the one below it. This wasn't just medieval architects showing off, it actually created more living space without paying for more ground space. Medieval property taxes were based on the ground floor size. It also kept rain off the lower walls and provided some shelter for pedestrians, though walking down a street lined with jettied buildings felt a bit like being in a slowly closing tunnel. The furniture inside these homes was surprisingly minimal by today's standards. Most pieces were multifunctional. Tables folded down from walls, chests served as both storage and seating, and beds often doubled as couches during the day. The most expensive piece was usually the cooking pot, which could cost as much as a cow and was often specifically mentioned in wills. These houses weren't just homes. They were investments that could be passed down through generations. Many middle-class families rented out rooms or entire floors to supplement their income, creating medieval versions of apartment buildings. Some of these structures still stand today in places like York, England, and Strasbourg, France, though they often lean at angles that would make the Tower of Pisa jealous. But who actually built these architectural marvels? The answer lies with the highly skilled craftsmen who learned their trade through years of apprenticeship. Building a medieval house was like organizing a massive group project, except instead of PowerPoint presentations, people were lifting massive oak beams. The process started with the master carpenter, who wasn't just a guy who knew how to swing a hammer. He was more like a medieval architect, engineer, and project manager rolled into one. These masters had spent at least 7 years as apprentices, learning everything from basic wood joints to complex structural calculations, though they probably wouldn't have called them that. The first step was sourcing materials, and this was where things got interesting. Oak trees for the main timbers had to be at least 60 years old, carefully selected during winter when the sap was low. Cutting down these giants was just the beginning. They needed to be shaped and seasoned for another year before they could be used. While waiting for the wood to dry, workers would dig the foundations and gather other materials like stone for the base of the house. Nobody wanted their fancy timber frame sitting directly on the ground to rot. Teams of specialized workers each had their roles. The sawyers, who cut the massive logs into usable pieces, worked in pairs using massive 2-person saws, with one poor soul in a pit below getting showered with sawdust all day. The carpenter's marks found on medieval timbers show they used a clever numbering system to keep track of which piece went where. Medieval IKEA instructions, if you will, though with fewer Allen wrenches and considerably more swearing. The actual construction time varied depending on the size and complexity of the house, but most middle-class homes took between 3 to 6 months to complete. The frame was usually assembled on the ground first, like a giant wooden puzzle, then raised section by section using a combination of ropes, pulleys, and a lot of people pushing and pulling. It was such an event that entire neighborhoods would turn out to help. Medieval barn-raising style, though probably with more ale involved and fewer safety regulations than we'd see today. Getting materials to the construction site was its own adventure. Stone was usually sourced from the nearest quarry, but if you lived in an area without good building stone, it had to be transported by river or cart from miles away. Clay for the wattle and daub came from local pits, while lime for mortar was burned in kilns outside town. The smell was apparently bad enough that laws required them to be built downwind. Straw and animal hair for binding the daub together came from local farms. Nothing went to waste in medieval construction. Even the hair from your neighbor's sheep might end up in your walls. The most fascinating part was how these builders worked without power tools or modern measuring equipment. They used ropes knotted at specific intervals for measuring, plumb bobs for ensuring walls were straight, and wooden templates for cutting joints. Their toolkits would look familiar to modern carpenters, just with more wood and less plastic. Chisels, axes, adzes, and saws were all carefully maintained and often passed down through generations like precious family heirlooms. One particularly clever innovation was the use of green, unseasoned wood for certain parts of the frame. As it dried, it would shrink and tighten the joints, making the whole structure stronger. It was like the medieval version of self-tightening nuts and bolts, except this process could take years to complete. During this time, the house would creak and groan as the wood settled, giving rise to many ghost stories that probably had more to do with physics than phantoms. The craftsmanship in these buildings was so precise that many have survived for centuries, outlasting countless modern structures. Each joint, each beam, each peg was placed with purpose and knowledge passed down through generations of builders. These weren't just houses, they were testaments to medieval engineering and skill. While these skilled craftsmen were busy creating homes for the middle class, an entirely different level of construction was taking place for the wealthy and royal residences. Royal and noble houses took medieval architecture to a whole new level. Literally, since some of their towers reached heights of over 80 feet. These magnificent buildings were constructed primarily from stone, which wasn't just about showing off wealth, though that was definitely part of it. Stone buildings could withstand attacks, fires, and the test of time. The walls were often 8 to 10 feet thick at the base, built with a technique called rubble-filled masonry, where two outer walls of dressed stone sandwiched a core of rubble and mortar. It was like a medieval stone sandwich that could stop arrows and siege weapons. The price tag for these palatial homes was astronomical. A large manor house could cost the equivalent of 850 years of a skilled craftsman's wages. That's not even counting the interior furnishings, which included luxuries like glass windows, each one costing about the same as a small farm, elaborate tapestries to keep the drafts out, and enough gold and silver plates to feed an army, which they sometimes had to do. Speaking of armies, these houses needed an army of staff just to keep them running. A typical noble household employed between 30 to 50 servants in various roles. You had your basic housekeepers and cooks, but also specialized positions like the keeper of the wardrobe, basically a medieval personal stylist, the master of the horse in charge of transportation, and even professional food tasters, arguably the most dangerous job in the medieval world. The staff hierarchy was more complex than a modern corporation's organizational chart. The interiors were designed to impress. The Great Hall was the heart of these homes, with ceilings high enough to let the smoke from the central hearth rise above the heads of diners. Fancy homes had chimneys, a revolutionary technology at the time that actually drew smoke out of the building instead of just hoping it would find its way out eventually. Windows were strategically placed to provide both light and defense, often with window seats built into the thick walls where ladies could sit and embroider while keeping an eye out for approaching visitors or invading armies. Storage was built for the long haul. These houses included massive cellars for keeping food and wine at constant temperatures and strong rooms for valuables. The kitchens were usually in separate buildings to reduce fire risk. Medieval fire insurance wasn't really a thing. Some houses even had primitive plumbing systems with rainwater collected from the roof and distributed through lead pipes, though given what we now know about lead, maybe the peasants were better off with their simple wells. The construction methods ensured these buildings would last centuries. Foundations were dug deep into bedrock. Stones were carefully shaped to fit together perfectly, often with iron cramps and lead poured between them for extra stability. Roofs were built with massive oak beams, many of which are still holding up today, 500 years later. The wood was often sourced from 200-year-old trees, meaning some of these roof timbers started growing during the Roman Empire. Yet while these magnificent homes stood as symbols of wealth and power, just outside their walls, the homes of the common people told a very different story. The stark contrast between noble mansions and peasant homes perfectly captured medieval inequality. While nobles worried about which tapestry matched their throne room, peasants hoped their roof would survive another winter. Peasant houses were tiny, usually just one room measuring about 12 by 24 feet. That's smaller than most modern living rooms, yet entire families plus their animals lived in this space. The animals weren't there for company. They provided essential body heat during winter, though probably not the most pleasant aromatherapy experience. Construction of these humble dwellings was quick and dirty, literally. The most common building technique was cruck construction, where two large curved timbers formed an A-frame. These weren't fancy oak beams either. Peasants used whatever trees they could find or were allowed to cut from the Lord's forest. The walls were made from wattle and daub, but unlike the carefully crafted walls of middle-class homes, peasants used whatever they could get their hands on. Straw, mud, dung, and even leftover animal bones mixed into the wall material. Medieval recycling at its finest. The roof was typically thatched with straw, which needed replacing every few years. A good thatch job could last up to 5 years if you were lucky, but most peasants couldn't afford quality materials or skilled thatchers. Instead, they patched their roofs annually with whatever plant material was available: reeds, heather, or even turf. During particularly bad years, it wasn't uncommon to see peasant houses sporting green, grassy roofs like some kind of unintentional medieval eco-home. The floor was usually just packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes or straw for insulation. These ground floors often became slightly sunken over time as years of sweeping and foot traffic wore them down, creating what archaeologists today excitedly call subterranean features, but what was really just a hole that collected water when it rained. Some peasants dug drainage channels around their houses, though these often became impromptu sewers, making the front yard smell like a medieval festival portable toilet. Furniture was minimal and rough. Most families had a single table and maybe a bench or two. Beds were luxuries. Most people slept on straw pallets on the floor. The central feature was the hearth, just a fire pit in the middle of the room with smoke finding its way out through a hole in the roof. This setup meant the house was either smoky or freezing, depending on whether you'd lit the fire, a real pick-your-poison situation. These houses typically lasted about 20 to 30 years before they needed to be completely rebuilt. That might sound short, but considering they were built in about 2 weeks with materials that could be gathered within walking distance, it wasn't a bad return on investment. Plus, when your house was made primarily of biodegradable materials, rebuilding was less like modern construction and more like very ambitious composting. While most peasant houses have long since returned to the earth they were built from, it's amazing to think that some of the grand stone buildings and sturdy timber frame houses from this era still stand today, serving as beautiful reminders of medieval craftsmanship. From the humblest peasant hut to the grandest castle, each type of medieval house tells its own story of survival, ingenuity, and the remarkable ability of humans to create homes that serve their needs no matter their social status.